Okay, and now that my remote is working, it's actually quite comfortable. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Sebastian Graf, and I submitted a proposal originally for TDOs about what my thoughts on freedom on the internet are. However, yesterday at the pub crawl, I decided to add a few other elements because we had a quite interesting discussion about open source. And I figured that some of the arguments that we had there, I should really share with you because they were quite enlightening to me at least. So there'll be a bit more content in it than you bargained for, which is a really, really good thing. So as I was saying, my name is Sebastian Graf. I'm an IT security researcher from Vienna. And my regular work consists of penetration testing and hacking boxes, basically. So I'm seeing a lot of different systems, seeing how they fail, seeing how they work. Some of them fail harder than others, but usually they fail at some point. Question is, what is that point? And the first thing that is usually most commonly mistaken when I talk to IT security people is they go ahead and take a look at the internet as a network, and they see their own part of it as what they are out to defend. However, they try not to see the big picture, so they are like a rat in a maze, really. But security is way more than just being able to defend your own network against an outside threat, because I think a study showed that 80% or so of all attacks come from within your network. So you need to armor that as well, which is what most people are really overlooking badly. I'll start with security because I've decided to break it down into three main components. One would be security. I'll talk a bit about usability, and I'll talk about freedom and how that whole thing strings together for me. So in IT security, I tend to notice that there's a lot of angry guys. I used to be really angry a couple of years back as well, and I still remember why. In comparison to most people, they don't remember it. And the reason is you go ahead, you try to implement some security measure, and it gets rejected. Or people try to circumvent it by any possible mean they can find. So if I were to go ahead and configure, let's say, internal firewalling, people will be, yeah, but then I can't reach the FTP server my colleague is running on his desktop computer where he stores all his porn, so I want access to it. Now, how do I get onto that bloody thing? Yeah, right. And in the end, I get a phone call that someone is ruining the network at the moment, and I have to go there and fix it. Which is not so pleasant for me. It's not so pleasant for the guy doing it, actually. And that gets you kind of angry and upset. Because you always face situations where you are the one that actually has to do more work because of trying to implement something properly, rather than implement it and be done with it, like any sort of crappy project. So the first thing I usually consider when I'm going to a project of any sort is called the wind chill factor. It comes from a reference out of a sci-fi book. I can't remember the bloody name of it, but it comes from there, and the wind chill factor actually describes the moment where you take a look at what systems are ahead if you go, or you assess all the systems on your network and think about what possible security threats could you have to deal with. How would it affect your network if one box is compromised? How about the others? Can you use it to bounce into the network? That sort of thing. So that is really trying to get a feeling of how cold it is in terms of how big your risk is. And once you've done that, you usually go ahead and set a goal to defend. Because going to a network and saying, OK, I'm going to improve everything, is not going to bloody work, because you have no starting point. However, if you take a bit less cautious approach and say, OK, so what is our biggest asset? What is the one thing, or what are the 10 things on our network that we want people to have the hardest time hacking into? Then you can actually go ahead and start raising the bar so they spend tremendous amounts of time getting onto the really interesting systems, and all the less interesting systems can be compromised a bit more easy. But you have an overall concept that actually can work in comparison to, OK, we'll build our own fortress. We need the highest castle walls we can find, and then we hope that it all strings together nicely. So from my perspective, you try to find yourself your precious systems. You try to, and then you try to wrestle anyone off who's trying to get at them, right? But this is some sort of limbo dance, because there's always a bar you have to remember. And the bar is like in limbo, one that how much time and effort do I need to actually pass it? Now, if you have a loosely configured network, it will be like this and you can just duck under it and be done. However, if you spend sheer amounts of time actually investing into catching every sort of little thing that could happen, the bar gets lowered and it's much harder to get in. I'm not saying it's impossible, because from my point of view, there is no 100% secure system. It is just that if I increase the time it takes you to hack the whole network by the factor of 4 or something, you'll actually be considering an easier target most of the times, which is what you're actually trying to accomplish. Of course, if you have a really, really targeted attack where I'm saying, OK, I'm coming specifically after you, even if you put enough measures into my way, I could still go ahead and say, OK, so virtual didn't work. Let's see if I can enter the building together with the smoking people that go outside in the break to smoke, and then you pass the security checks with them if you go in. Which is a tremendous concept, and it works all the time. Just find the smokers and go in with them. Security guards will not check them, and then you're in and try to locate the server room. Bring a little wireless access point with you, plug it in, leave the building, and go in from the outside using a big antenna. So that is another thing that you should actually be aware of in terms of security concepts in general. That, OK, so now you've closed all the loopholes for you can figure out in the virtual world, but people can still easily enter your building. And there's a lot of open connectors for cables. You just plug in and have a go. There's no real separation in some cases, so you plug in and you do a little scan. Oh, wait, I just hit the Linux server. Then you try to take the server. You may manage to. And from there, you scan again, and woo, all the BSD boxes are there. Even more Linux servers, and maybe a few Solaris boxes or something like that. So in general, it is also one of the problems you usually deal with is not only thinking about what happens when they come into the network and try to take a box, but assuming that they already managed to compromise a few machines. What can they do with that? Because if I compromise one machine, I can bounce into another part of the network that that machine may see on its second network card that I didn't have access to before. So placing a box into two different networks and not separating clearly between them is a big problem. Because even if you have really good separation at your switching level, and one box has two network cards and is in both networks, therefore, if the box is taking a jump from one network to the other, and the whole security measure just goes down the river. So bouncing off machines is actually another big thing I usually have to deal with, because that's what most attackers do. You compromise one machine in the demilitarized zone, and you jump into the more secure zones in that environment. And then you're majorly doomed. And even worse, let's assume that the box that you try to get has no connection to the internet. But what you can do is you can use the machine you already compromised as a proxy server, and then go ahead and you can do this 3 to 4 stages into the network. So there'll be all forwarding relationships towards the one machine that actually sees the internet and therefore sees you. It's a bit complex to set up, but there's a few really good resources on how to actually do that on different mailing lists, and if you really want to know how bounce attacks work, I really suggest reading them. On the other side of the hand, one of the previous things that I also did was hacking home routers. This being a Linksys, that one was particularly easy to take a couple of years back, but now they fixed most of the problems with the Linux on it. However, there's still going to be issues with any sort of home router. And the worst part about home routers, which struck me back then, is, OK, so assuming you take a box that has a DSL interface, this one doesn't, but if you have one that goes from your local area network, which is Ethernet, to DSL, and there's the modulation and stuff in hardware, and you manage to take that box and the user doesn't notice it, you can actually do nice man-in-the-middle attacks by injecting content, and therefore taking other parts of the network, or reading the traffic and such things. And this can be used for sheer amounts of bad stuff. But that's only two to three examples I've given so far. But my point is, and that is really important, with security you always run into the problem that a new threat emerges, you try to chase your tail around it, new problem emerges, you do that again, then another one pops up because you fixed two other ones, now you gotta try to see the big picture again, try to fix that. So it's always some sort of rat race. And that gets really exhaustive. And still, you're always trying to prevent something new from popping up with keeping in mind that if you try to fix this in one particular way, another hole back there will open up. It's like you have a submarine boat and you're trying to fix all the holes in it so it doesn't sink. And yeah, you could take that piece of metal there and put it there so it doesn't leak, but then water will come back in from there. So it's kind of interesting to see, really. The other part that I wanted to throw in, which wasn't originally in the proposal, but that we discussed about yesterday, was usability. Because there's this myth, or actually people say it's common sense, but for me it isn't, about every step you take towards security, you lose out on usability, which sounds like a clever concept at first, because yeah, so you make it more secure, therefore it has to be less usable, right? No, it isn't. It usually just means you haven't bothered taking time to actually figure out what's going wrong. Allow me to explain. Usually, people like programmers and open source nerds, and even I at times, admit it, assume that every user is really, really gifted. And the reason why we jump to that sort of conclusion is because you offer them an option, and they'll usually mistake it for something totally different. I like that. Woo! Or we. Okay, but for me, personally, there's a fundamental difference between not knowing and ignorance. Because ignorance means that I could be aware of it if I wanted to be. However, I'm not, because I chose to ignore the whole topic before I could actually take a look into it. Whereas not knowing for me means that you try something and it doesn't bloody work because it's working in a different way than you expected. And that is actually a mistake that the user didn't make, but the developer of the thing made. I'll guarantee you that in about a minute. That is sort of the usual scenario I'm referring to. The user doing something and the admin screaming, no, that's not how you're supposed to do it, right? However, just imagine that he would be there and the thing on the screen would bloody work. The only thing actually preventing this in a theoretical scenario is the developer writing the software. But now you are stuck in the situation where a person that may not have written it, but is just surveying the user, trying the new piece of software, is actually raging at the user for using it not in the same way technical people would do. For me personally, good software is like a bento box. As you can see, I'm really well fed and I like bentos. However, a bento box has something beautiful to it, and you may not see it at first. But what you see there is good content packaged modularly, because it's packaged into modules, as you can clearly see. Everything has a purpose. Everything actually can be used and can be eaten, or most of it. The box here for the soy sauce may be not so good in terms of being edible. But aside from that, most of it can be eaten. It's packaged beautifully. It's modular. You can reuse the plastic afterwards. It's quite a cool and sustainable concept. And if I take a look at this, the only thing that really comes to my mind is simple. If I compare it to a regular product like a hot dog. So do you see the difference? Right. Which one would you choose? Just yeah, and now imagine it would be your software. Do you want a software that looks like this or like this? Okay, maybe your taste. But in general, I would rather have a software that is beautifully packaged rather than being wrong direction. Rather than being totally thrown together and being greasy and fatty. Damn, I went back 3 slides because I didn't see that. I have one on the next one. A quote that really struck me is this one, because not enough gets said about the importance of abandoning crap. why do you have functions in your software that people don't actually use? And if they don't actually use it, there may be two reasons for it. One being, no one needs it, which is quite often the case, but somebody decided, well, it's easy to do with our current sort of thing, so we'll throw it in. Which makes a tremendous amount of energy you have to invest into maintaining that stuff, even if no one's using it. Or the second one, it's implemented so badly that no one can use it, which may also be the case. For me, writing code is the same as writing a book. I'm not particularly good at writing books, because I just don't feel like writing a shitload of text using my hand. But generally speaking, all writing is a process of elimination. And deciding what to fit in and what to leave out is a really, really hard call. And in terms of usability, I think it's the most important thing and the most fundamental thing to think about. What can you put in? What does the user really need and what doesn't need? And if you reduce the amount of complexity in your code by reducing the amount of stuff the user doesn't need, you're actually having less code to maintain, and therefore you can get a better picture of what can go wrong, what can be exploited. Therefore you actually have a better chance of preventing it, rather than saying, okay, so here's my 10,000 lines of code for a simple email program, which you could do, and possibly maybe 5,000 if you cut out the unnecessary crap, because I could interconnect my email client to my calendar, but that's about it. I don't really need the functionality of a full calendar embedded into my email client. That sort of thing, because I have a calendar application usually and an email application. If you add the other one, it's in there, but you won't use it, because in most of the cases you have two different applications. And that sort of piggyback code that you carry around that you don't really need tends to cause you a lot of problems. And by eliminating that, you reduce the amount of complexity and the amount of problems directly. There's nice statistical reviews on that from what they're called. I can look it up. I have a paper on reducing the amount of complexity and how it scales with reducing the amount of problems associated with it. And also, I wanted to talk about surveillance. Not that sort of surveillance, but I generally found that people really prefer video cameras as an object for discussion, or to get them into the mood for discussing about software surveillance. Although, as we know on the internet, there are cameras and you can watch them on the internet, but they do not film the internet directly. And the reason why people try to sell us surveillance is they say it's for the greater good. It is to protect the children. It is for various other reasons. But I don't really think that holds true. This morning I made a note to myself that I should take my medicine, because otherwise I wouldn't be capable of actually giving this talk. However, there is something interesting to it. Because you have, in every society, you have to have a couple of people that are quite paranoid about things. And they usually give you, if it's this sort of paranoid that is not a clinical condition, but they're just seeing everything black and they're taking a look at what the government does, that's totally fine, and you need a few of them to actually keep things in check, in my opinion. But we shouldn't look at all of this that badly. I mean, okay, it's really, really bad if someone is actually forced to log every email that goes into and out of your system and hand it over on demand. Not necessarily for the reason that you couldn't encrypt the email, so they only know who you're talking to and when, but not about what. But the thing that it does is, now that you actually have to store it, you have a legit reason to put it onto some drive, and someone that is not supposed to have access to it may have access to it. And that is not cool, in my opinion. But also, every time you think you have seen the last of the new laws currently passing for regulating on what you can do on the internet and what not, something new pops up and scares the shit out of you, and then it hits you directly into the face. Boom. Yeah? The reason why we're really losing the freedom on the internet as for now is a totally different one. It is not about the regulations being made. it is not about politics. It's not even about crappy software design. The real reason is people started to ignore it. Now, what do I mean by that? Usually, when there's something bad happening, you have a big scream. But over the last couple of years, what happens is the screaming got quite frequent because new law passes, you can't do this anymore, or this and that is restricted. People scream. 2 weeks later, same thing, different topic. 3 weeks later, the same thing. What happens is, if you hear something happen often enough, you will start to ignore it directly. This is something your brain does. I can compare it to any one of you allowed to ride a car. You ride a car, or possibly your own, and you ride it for a couple of hours, and what you usually tend to notice is after about 2 hours of riding it, you stop hearing the engine, although it's still producing noise. And the same thing happens. Your brain develops a filter for information it thinks it has seen already. So you need to be really, really careful and really aware of that happening, that you actually go ahead and block out that filter and take a look at, okay, this is currently happening at the moment, what we can do. Oh, what can we do? There's also a few other happy things I can report. And I really, really love to talk about this. Recently attended an event in Japan, and it was a closed source event, but I was startled by the idea that they actually had a couple of open source talks. Or open source, maybe not, but open talks at least. And what you hear these days, if you go into major companies in Japan, is they talk a bit about opening the kimono. Not necessarily meaning that they're going to give away all their source code they've written so far. But the trend you see with big companies currently is they're trying to be more transparent, which is actually one of the main things that I'm concerned about, because openness actually means you care about others. Because this way, even though the code is not accessible, they are open about how stuff works, meaning you can actually go ahead and maybe able to ask them about, okay, so how does this work? Can I write a program to interact with it? Do you have an API that is not documented that I may still be able to use, rather than going the dirty way and inserting your hooks on driver level or whatever. So there's a few things you can now do. Let me just check. I didn't have much time to prepare for this, and I've been drinking heavily yesterday night.
There was no beer.
Yeah, but we went to another bar. And another. And another. That was about it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, right. There we are. Open source. And because when I'm drinking the day before, I usually tend to forget stuff. That's why I've written notes on the second machine. You see, open source for me holds the holy grail. The holy grail of mankind. And it is one thing you wouldn't, that is so obvious that most people don't even think about it. People are like, open source, free software, yay, now we can have the code. But for me, it's about something totally different. Open source for me means that you value knowledge. And the knowledge can be shared and can be copied. And that is something really important. And going ahead and actually seeing what currently governments are trying to do to our world, that is totally wrong, because the internet used to be cool and is still cool to this day, because it doesn't limit what you can do. Because in the real world, you may be forced to do something you don't like. You may be at a point where you can't really, where you're limited at least in some way to perform under the optimal amounts of stuff you can get. However, on the internet, you have unlimited freedom as long as you're willing to participate. And that way, the Holy Grail can only be one thing, the power of wisdom. And open source, no matter if it applies to code or if it applies to knowledge, because also knowledge and technologies can be open source, even if there's no code written for it yet, is a tremendously valuable thing. However, I saw a trend. I usually, when I take look at, one second. Usually when I take a look at stuff in the open source field, there's a few things that really stick out with it. One of them being people choose their side and then stick with it like a religion. A couple of years back, luckily it's not that frequent anymore, but you always had flame wars going on conferences about what operating system is best, what text editor should you use, what fucking IRC client do you depend on. It may sound like fun, but however, once you pick a side for software, you're just going to glorify that one thing without taking a look at what's out there as well, or how you could improve everything else to meet higher standards. That is a big issue. And it sort of becomes religious at some point, like the discussion between VI and Emacs. I've seen a flame war going on recently between both fractions, and it was not pretty. The only thing that was good about it is we didn't need the police to call it off. Because apparently nerds that have no upper body strength can't fight that good. But there were still a few glasses and stuff flying through the air. But we got it under control within half an hour, and then everyone was really exhausted and went for another drink. Just to take the cab home after. But usually you can't really argue with people that start to inherit beliefs so strongly that it almost ties into religion. And a character from a TV series called House actually stated this really good. If you could reason with religious people, there would be none. Which is a good theory in itself. But it is not quite true. Because just putting everyone that likes a certain distribution into one box is totally wrong. And therefore, you can basically fuck that theory. However, only because you choose a distribution or because you choose a framework or whatever you like, which is one of the big possibilities in free software and open source, that you can choose a flavor that you like. You still need to keep in mind that you should actually go ahead and try to make it better for everyone, not just you. Because the code documents itself issue is a really bad problem. So let's say you find a new software you like and it has a bug and you want to fix it. There's nothing more frustrating about it than not being able to, because somewhere there's a file called documentation. You open it up and it says the code speaks for itself. Then you take a look at the code and it's Perl. And even worse, it was written by some 12-year-old that didn't bother to put up documentation because he didn't know how to write it. And he wrote code that barely works, but then you're trying to monkey patch it in order to get it working again. That is what can also happen to you. And I'm actually begging you, please try to avoid this, because it gets on my nerves from time to time. The other thing that directly goes from there is simple for us is not simple for them. Because usually when I develop software and it's simple for me to write it and it is intuitive for me, it is not simple to use for others. Because I have my own train of thought where I expect stuff to be. However, I'm a technical guy. A standard user would never expect it to be there, or they would never expect the software to work using shortcuts only, because they expect sort of menus that they can click. Or maybe more than a program running in pure console mode or something. So it is really important trying to also think about what is easy for others. Because the works for me attitude is nice as long as I don't think about sharing it. But the moment I go and want to share it, I should really make sure that even if it takes me more time initially to go ahead and implement it, I should really also consider what is easy for the others. Where does it need to be? As a fun project, while I was drinking with a couple of friends, about 2 years back, we decided to write presentation software that is easy to use, that auto-detects Beamer and stuff. And it's called Dofu. You can Google it and download it and see if we did a good job at it. But what we did is, even for a small piece of software, we spent a few weeks of time going ahead and researching how people would want their interface. We spent a couple of more weeks of time actually trying to implement it and then having it tested by regular people. I still remember I would go and ask a business partner of mine if I could borrow his wife for 2 hours. And he said, "What?" I said, "Well, I have this piece of software that I would like her to test because she's the most non-technical person I can think of." He's like, "Okay, but only if I'm supervising." So the hardest part about this was not having her play on my laptop, but keeping him from yelling instructions to her, which is a big part in user testing. Because if you try to find honest users that don't know stuff, and you try to build an interface that even they can use, you should really make sure that there's no one in the room actually secretly giving them instructions, so it falsifies your test results. And also, one of the most stupid things I've ever done is go to a user and ask him, "How do you expect it to be?" And the user replied to me, "Can you tell me how I'm supposed to work with it?" This may sound fun, but in the end, it ends up with a lot of frustration on my side because the user isn't happy, and the user isn't happy because he doesn't like it the way I did it, although he suggested it before. So doing this sort of research into how to make stuff usable is really hard. The thing is, at least for me, if you have enough education, let's just skip this one, this is stupid. But this one I really, really like. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are a few. Let's think about this for a second. Because in the beginner's mind, meaning that anyone that is not as deeply into technical stuff as I am, or as many of you may be, and wait, I was wrong. The beginner's mind, basically imagine a small child, okay? And the small child actually is creative, it does stuff, and it just tries it out, and therefore isn't limited. The experts, like we are, we actually have our predefinitions of how stuff is supposed to work, and that limits the sort of impact we can make on the world, because there's many solutions we can't come up with because we don't see them, because our brain already has a filter to ignore them. And that is a really, really important lesson we can actually learn from children. And I have a good example to demonstrate this. Unfortunately, I haven't brought enough paper and pens, so we can try it now. But you can try it your companies later on. What you do is you ask your audience about this big to grab a piece of paper and a pen each. And then they have to choose the one sitting next to them. And they have to picture them. And you give them an extremely short amount of time, maybe 30 seconds, 1 minute, to picture their partner. And they do it. And of course, they'll fail horribly. And after this 1 minute, they have to show it to their partner. And this is where you have a moment of them being a bit embarrassed. And you hear a lot of laughter because it's funny as hell to see how bad other people picture you. And then with adults, you hear a lot of, "I'm sorry," and "I'm terribly sorry," and "Oh, I'm so sorry." And that is actually the lesson. Because if you do the same experiment with kids, they'll have to because it's funny. However, they will not say, "I'm sorry." Because children, compared to adults, are not afraid to take a chance. And that is something really, really valuable that we should try to get ourselves back and try to preserve ourselves. The chance of actually, the train of thought to actually take a chance without thinking, "I'm going to regret this in a minute." And what we can learn from that is imagination is way more powerful than knowledge. And using your creativity, all the free resources you have, using your knowledge and bringing up new ideas in order to try to keep the internet a free place and also to make it more usable in any possible mean, hopefully will lead you to make some big impact. That's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Any questions?
I think they're really tired now.